Montana Territory, 1882. The sky was so wide it felt like a lie, and as Florence Kesler stood on the porch of her father's ranch house, she held her breath like it might change what was coming. "You'll marry him by Sunday," her father said, voice stiff with drink and heat. Florence did not answer. She kept her eyes on the dry hills rolling out beyond the corral, where a few horses stood still as statues. Her heart beat too hard to speak. She could see the barn where her mother's wedding dress still hung, yellowed and forgotten. She remembered her mother's voice, soft and kind, long buried now. "Did you hear me?" he snapped. "Yes," she said. Clayton Rudd was a brute. 38, rich from cattle and blood and meaner than a starving wolf. He had already broken 2 wives, everyone knew it, but her father owed him money and Florence was the payment. She was 22. She had no brothers, no money, and no way out until the cowboy rode in. It happened the next morning. Florence was in the barn, brushing the old mare, Goldie, letting the quiet calm her. The wedding was 2 days away. Her stomach twisted every time she thought of it. The barn doors creaked open. She turned, brush still in hand. A tall man stepped into the light. Dust clung to his boots. His shirt was sun-bleached and damp at the collar. He wore a wide hat, shadowing his face, but when he looked at her, she saw eyes a blue too sharp to forget. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for work," her voice caught. "We are not hiring." "I figured," he said. "But I saw your herd down by the creek. One's limping. Thought maybe you'd want help before she goes lame." Florence hesitated. "You a wrangler?" "Used to be," he said. "Name's Finch O'Connell." That name hit something in her. She stared at him closer now. The jaw, the eyes, the way he stood not just easy but like he had nothing left to prove. She remembered a boy with a crooked smile who had given her a ribbon when she was 9. "Finch," she said slowly. "You're Finch O'Connell from Dry Creek," he smiled. "That was a long time ago." Her throat tightened. "You left after the fire." "I did," she nodded. The fire had taken his parents his home. He had been 16. She never saw him again until now she looked at him again. He had grown into a man who carried silence like a second skin, but not the kind that hid fear. The kind that held steady when the world shook. He looked past her to the mare. "You need help or not?" he asked. She let out a breath. "Come on." He worked all morning, hands sure and quiet. By noon, the limp was gone and her father was sober enough to notice him. "Who the hell is that?" he barked at Florence. "Finch O'Connell," she said. "He worked the herd, fixed Lacey's hoof." Her father narrowed his eyes. "We do not need another mouth to feed." "He already ate nothing," Florence said, "and the mare would be lame without him." Her father grunted and turned away, muttering curses, but he did not send Finch off. That night, Florence sat on the porch alone, watching the sun drop behind the hills. Finch walked up, hat in hand. "You always this quiet?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes thoughtful. "You always this brave?" Her mouth pulled into a tired smile. "Not brave, just stuck." He sat beside her, close but not too close. "I heard about Rudd." She flinched. "It is not your problem." "It is now," he said. She looked at him, heart thudding. "Why?" "Because you do not belong to a man like that," he said plainly. "And because when I saw you today, I remembered what it felt like to want something good." Her breath caught. He added, "I do not leave things burning anymore." They sat in silence after that, but it was not empty. It was heavy with something building, something neither of them had let themselves hope for in years. The next day, Rudd came to the ranch. He rode in with 2 men, thick with sweat and dust, and his smile was all teeth. "Ready to be a wife, girl," he said like she was already his. Florence stood beside Finch, chin high. "I am not going with you." Rudd's eyes landed on Finch. "Who is this?" "Your stable hand." Finch stepped forward, calm. "Her husband." Florence froze. Rudd laughed. "You lying bastard." Finch took her hand and held it up. "We were married this morning by Reverend McCree. You can ask him yourself. She is mine now." Her heart thundered, but she did not pull away. Rudd's face went red. "You think you can steal from me?" "She is not property," Finch said flatly. "And this land is not yours. If you try to take her, I will put you in the ground." Rudd's hand twitched near his belt, but Finch did not move. He just held her hand, steady and sure. Rudd spat and turned his horse. This ain't over." They watched him ride off. Florence turned to Finch, breathless. "You lied." He looked at her. "No, I meant every word." Her lips trembled. "You just married me," he nodded. "I did." She stared at him, heart full and terrified. "Why?" He touched her cheek, light as a whisper. "Because I loved you when I was a boy, and I think I love you even more now." Tears filled her eyes. He said, "You do not have to love me back, but you are free now, and I will keep you safe." She stepped closer, her hand pressed to his chest. "I think I already do," she said. And then she kissed him, right there on the porch, while the sun burned low and the wind carried the scent of dust and hope. They were married by name, but now they were bound by something stronger, love, and it was just the beginning. The air was still before dawn, thick with the hush that settles before a storm. Florence sat on the wooden bench outside the bunkhouse, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Finch had risen early, already out near the south pasture checking the fence line. She hadn't asked him to. He just saw what needed doing and did it. Behind her, the bunkhouse door creaked open. Elijah, a stoop-shouldered ranch hand who had worked for her father since she was small, stepped out, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You always up this early now?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. She didn't look at him. "Couldn't sleep." He walked past her, heading for the water barrel. "Folks'll talk, you know," he said over his shoulder. "'Bout you and that man showing up married out of nowhere." "They already do," she replied. Elijah shrugged. "Still, I seen worse matches." Florence traced the rim of her cup. "He's kind." "That's rare," Elijah said, tipping water into his hat before putting it on his head. "You'd be a fool not to hold on." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth sat low in her belly like something planted deep. By mid-morning, the sky turned a hard silver, clouds banking in from the west. Florence knew that light snow would come fast once it started. She crossed the yard, skirts tucked up, and found Finch near the fence where the land dipped into a shallow draw. "You'll catch cold out here," she said, pulling her shawl tighter. He straightened, wiping grit from his hands. "There's a break in the wire." "Elk must have come through." "Can it wait?" He glanced at the sky. "Not if we want the herd to stay put." She studied his face. There was a small scar near his temple she hadn't noticed before, pale against the weathered skin. She wanted to ask where he got it, but instead she said, "You always fix things yourself." He looked at her, something unreadable passing between them. "I don't like leaving things open." She knelt beside him without asking, holding the coil steady while he pulled the wire taut. Their hands brushed once, and neither of them moved away. When the work was done, they walked back slow. The wind had risen, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. Finch stopped at the edge of the barn and turned to her. "You ever think of leaving this place?" he asked. "I used to," she said. "But my mother's buried on that hill. I couldn't carry her memory far enough to leave it behind." He nodded, quiet. Then, after a moment, "I've been thinking of building a small cabin past the creek near where the cottonwoods grow thick, if the ground's not too rocky." She blinked. "Why?" He didn't look away. "Because I don't plan to sleep in the bunkhouse forever, and you deserve more than someone playing at being your husband." Her throat tightened. He added, "But I won't ask you for anything until you want it freely." She reached out then, slow and certain, and took his hand. "I don't want to play at anything either." The storm broke before sundown. Snow came hard, slanting sideways with the wind. They spent the evening in the main house, the fire burning low while the windows fogged. Florence mended a torn sleeve of his shirt by lamplight. Finch sat across from her, carving a piece of wood into the rough shape of a bird. "I never asked," she said. "Where have you been all these years?" He kept his eyes on the carving. "Wyoming, then Idaho, spent 2 winters up near the Bitterroot, worked cattle, trapped some, got caught in a flood, nearly lost my horse. Somewhere in there I stopped keeping track of the months. You ever think of coming back?" He nodded once. "Every spring." She tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. "Why now?" He set the carving down. "This time I had no reason not to." She crossed the room and sat beside him, her voice low. "And now," he turned to her, "now I got one." They didn't touch then. They didn't need to. The fire cracked softly, and outside the wind sang through the trees. Inside, the quiet between them held something steady and warm. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew down to her bones that she would not face it alone. The snow eased by morning, leaving the world muffled and pale. Wind had swept drifts up against the fence posts, and the trees bowed under delicate white weight. Finch shoveled a path from the porch to the barn, steam curling from his breath, his movements unhurried but certain. Florence watched from the kitchen window, her hand resting on the sill, the warmth of the stove at her back. Inside, the house was quiet but no longer hollow. She'd wrapped the extra quilt around their bed last night without thinking twice. The gesture had been small, instinctive, and it had meant something. When Finch returned, boots heavy with packed snow, she handed him a tin mug of broth. He took it without comment, nodding once in thanks. They stood in the kitchen, the silence companionable. "There's a trail of rabbit tracks by the woodpile," he said after a moment. "I can set a snare if you want stew tomorrow," she nodded. "The flour's low, I'll make do without biscuit." He leaned against the counter, watching the curtain sway slightly in the draft. "Your father's been gone 2 days. He won't be back until he's drunk through the last of his temper," she said flatly. "That's how it always is." Finch studied her, then set the mug down. "You want me to fix up the old tack shed?" She turned to him sharply. "Why? It's got a good roof." "Could use a stove and some sealant around the door. Might be a place of our own while we plan the cabin." Florence's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "You think we can just live like this, like nothing ever happened?" "No," he said. "I think we can live like we're choosing something better." She didn't answer. The wind caught the doorframe and the kitchen creaked faintly. "I'll cut the lumber today," he added. "Won't take long to brace the walls." She followed him out later, pulling on her boots and wrapping her scarf high around her neck. He was already at the shed, measuring with a length of twine, his coat dusted with sawdust. She fetched the nails without being asked. They worked in tandem without speaking, the kind of rhythm that forms not from practice but from shared purpose. As the sun climbed, the wind quieted. A hawk passed overhead, its shadow sweeping the snow like a hand over silk. "You always build things?" she asked once the new beam was in place and the door hung straight. "Only what I can live with," he said. She looked at the small space, just wide enough for a bed and a stove. "It'll be warm enough. Soon as I get the chimney cut," he said. "I can sleep here tonight if you'd rather stay in the house." "I'm not sending you to sleep on boards," she said, her voice taut. "We married for my sake, but that doesn't mean I get to forget you're a man who's earned more than cold planks and borrowed blankets." He looked at her then. Not with surprise, but with something slower, deeper. "You think I did this just to be noble?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze. "Didn't you?" He stepped closer, brushing his glove against her sleeve. "I did it because I wanted you to be free. But I stayed because I want a life with you." Head bowed, she reached up and pulled off her scarf, letting it fall into her hands. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to start over." "You don't have to," he said. "We just keep going. One day at a time." The wind shifted, bringing the scent of pine from the hills. She stepped into him, resting her forehead against his chest. He hesitated a breath, then wrapped his arms around her, slow and sure, like he'd been waiting for her to let go of whatever weight she carried. They stood like that until the sun tilted lower, warming the snow just enough to make it drip from the eaves. That night, they laid the bedroll in the shed and lit the first fire in the small stove Finch had borrowed from the bunkhouse. The heat spread slow but steady like trust. Florence rolled toward him as the fire dimmed, the glow catching the curve of her cheek. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He reached for her hand beneath the quilt, fingers threading through hers. "No," he said. "I believe in choosing again and again. For as long as it takes." She didn't speak, but she turned her face into his shoulder and the quiet held them, not empty but full. The days stretched longer as March settled in, though the sun still rose with frost clinging to the window panes. Florence woke early, the sound of Finch splitting kindling outside the shed steady and sure. She lingered beneath the quilt a moment longer, watching her breath cloud in the cold air, listening to the rhythm of the axe. Not hurried, not harsh, just steady. When she stepped outside, the air bit at her cheeks. Finch had stripped down to his shirt sleeves, his coat slung over a fence rail. He didn't look up as she approached, but his voice reached her soft and even. "There's a trader passing through from Fort Benton. Elijah said he'll stop at the ranch by midday." She rubbed her hands together. "What's he carry? Tools, fabric, seed. Might have molasses if we're lucky." She leaned against the post nearest him, watching the blade rise and fall. "You thinking of planting?" "Just enough for a kitchen garden," he said. "Something to make this place feel like it belongs to us." She didn't reply right away. Her gaze drifted to the small rise west of the shed, where the snow had begun to thin and patches of dry grass showed through. "I could try carrots," she said. "And beans if there's twine for the stakes." Finch paused, resting the axe against the stump. "I'll make the stakes myself." When the trader arrived, his wagon drawn by a pair of shaggy mules, Florence stepped forward with her basket of eggs and 2 pairs of knitted socks she'd finished during the long evenings. The man, grizzled and wind-chapped, took the trade without fuss, handing her a bolt of rough cotton and a tin of dried apples in return. Finch bartered for nails and a tin kettle, and when the wagon wheeled away down the rutted road, the quiet returned like a trusted neighbor. Later that afternoon, Florence stood beside the shed, arms crossed, watching Finch measure the slope of the land behind it. "You think we can fit a root cellar there?" she asked. "If we brace the back wall and dig before the ground hardens again, it'll hold." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You've been thinking about this longer than you let on." He ran a hand along the brim of his hat. "I've spent years moving." Thinking about stopping took longer. She studied him, the way the light caught the stubble on his jaw, how the small crease beside his eye deepened when he looked toward the horizon. "I've never had a man plan a life around me," she said. "I'm not planning around you," he said quietly. "I'm building it with you." That night, they sat in the shed still unfinished, but warm with the fire and the closeness they no longer questioned. The kettle whistled gently, and the scent of apples filled the small space. Florence wrapped her shawl tighter and stared at the flame. "My mother used to say peace wasn't something you waited for. You had to carve it out of whatever was left." Finch didn't respond right away. He reached for 2 tin mugs, poured the hot cider, and handed one to her. "She was right," he said. "I've known men who waited their whole lives for something that never came." They drank in silence. The wind had died outside and the night pressed close against the walls, but inside, the warmth held. Florence set her mug down and leaned back against the wood. "What did you leave behind when you came back?" He traced the rim of his cup with one finger. "A man named Grayson, owned a spread near Boys. I worked his cattle 3 seasons. He offered me land, said I could stay." "Why didn't you?" Finch looked at her then. The space between them felt thinner than breath. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about the girl who gave me the only blue ribbon I ever owned," he said. "And how she looked at me like I was worth saving." Florence reached up slowly, brushing the side of his face with her fingers. Her touch was light, but her voice was steady. "You weren't the only one who remembered." They didn't speak after that. He leaned in and she met him halfway. The kiss wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was quiet, like everything they'd built between them earned and strong. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "I want to marry you proper," he said, "with vows and a witness." "You think the preacher'll do it twice?" she asked, eyes shining. "He'll do it once right," Finch said. "And I'll do it every day after." Florence smiled then, not with relief but with something firmer. Trust, maybe, or the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Outside, the new moon rose thin and silver over the ridge, and inside, the fire stirred low and steady, like something just begun. The preacher arrived on the 3rd Sunday after the thaw, his mule limping from a loose shoe and his coat stained with travel. He carried a leather-bound Bible and a sack of letters for the valley's scattered folk, and when he stepped inside the main house, He removed his hat with a reverence that matched the hush in the room. Florence had braided her hair herself, fingers steady despite the weight in her chest. The cotton dress she wore was plain undyed, just cleaned and pressed that morning, but she'd stitched a row of small blue flowers along the hem, careful and slow, one petal at a time in the weeks since Finch asked her. Finch stood straight beside her, his best shirt tucked into freshly brushed trousers, his boots cleaned with a rag and elbow grease. He held her hand as the preacher spoke, but not tightly, just enough that she could feel the truth of it. "You take her as your wife before God, plain and clear?" the preacher asked. "I do," Finch said, voice steady. Florence met his eyes, her own quiet but full. "And I take him," she said before the preacher could ask. "Plain and clear," the preacher smiled, lines deepening around his eyes. "Then it's done." He left soon after, taking the mule slow into the hills. There was no music, no feast, just the wind brushing through the cottonwoods and the sound of the creek running fuller now with meltwater. That night, Finch lit the stove early and hung Florence's shawl near the wall where the heat would catch it. She didn't ask him to. She followed him out to the new cabin the next morning. It wasn't finished, but the frame stood, and the roof had gone on 2 days earlier. The walls were bare timber, the windows still missing glass, but she could smell the cedar and see where the hearth would rise from stone Finch had gathered by hand. "I want your hands on the rest of it," he said, setting his tool belt down. "Not just mine." She stepped inside and ran her fingers along the door frame. "I want a shelf beside the bed, for my mother's book." "We can build that first," he said. They worked until Florence's palms were sore. She laid the stones for the hearth while Finch measured the loft beams. They didn't speak much, but the quiet between them had changed again, no longer made of waiting, but of building. Of choosing. That night back in the shed, Florence took her mother's book from the cedar chest where she'd kept it wrapped in linen. She set it on the small table Finch had carved from scrap wood and looked around the room. The quilt was folded at the foot of the bed, the kettle still hung over the low stove. Outside, the moon shone wide over the ridge. "You think we'll have children?" she asked softly. Finch didn't answer right away. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots. When he looked up, his eyes had changed. "If we do," he said, "they'll grow up knowing what it means to stay." She crossed to him and knelt, brushing her fingers along the worn knee of his trousers. "I'd like that." "I would too," he said. The days turned to weeks, and the cabin rose around them. Elijah helped with the roof joists, and Florence traded eggs and stitching in town for window glass and nails. Her father returned once, sober but bitter, his jaw tight when he saw how the shed had become a home. "You've made your bed," he said, standing in the yard. "I have," Florence replied, voice calm, "and I'll lie in it with a man who doesn't drink his debts down." He left without another word. She didn't watch him go. By summer, the cabin stood finished, tucked into the slope behind the cottonwoods. The garden behind it pushed up green shoots, carrots, beans, and a patch of feverfew grown from seeds a neighbor widow pressed into Florence's hands. Finch carved her shelf. Florence embroidered a pair of curtains with thread she dyed herself from onion skins and sumac. They slept with the windows open, the air warm and sweet, and sometimes he reached for her hand in the dark without needing to speak. One afternoon in late July, Florence came in from the garden with dirt under her nails and a sprig of mint between her fingers. She set the mint on the table, washed her hands, and turned to find Finch watching her from the doorway. "You're different now," he said. She dried her hands on her apron. "How? You move like you're not waiting anymore." She crossed the room and touched his chest, just above the heart. "That's because I'm not." He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with the surety of someone who had waited long enough and was no longer afraid. Fall came gentle. They filled the root cellar and stacked firewood shoulder high. The days shortened and the evenings drew quiet again, but never lonely. Florence's belly rounded with new life, slow and certain. Finch built a cradle from pine, his hands careful as ever. The morning the baby came, the first snow had just dusted the ridge. Finch boiled water and fed the stove, steady through her pain, his voice low beside her through each wave. When the child arrived, red-faced and wailing, Florence wept not from fear, not from sorrow, but from the aching fullness of it. "It's a girl," she whispered, brushing the damp cheek with her thumb. Finch wrapped them both in a wool blanket and held them as the fire cracked low. They named her Ruth, after Florence's mother. That winter, the three of them lived close and still in the cabin they'd raised with bare hands. Finch read aloud from the Bible on Sundays. Florence sang to Ruth in the hush before dawn. The wind pressed against the walls, but inside there was only warmth, nothing grand, nothing loud, just the quiet strength of love built plank by plank. And they lived there together. For the rest of their days, Florence, Finch, and the daughter born of their choosing carving peace from the land, and never once letting go.